Labor MP Ed Husic. Ed, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Now, you're probably the most prominent Muslim member of Parliament. How do you feel about this ASIO report talking about the right of right-wing extremism in particular and the focus the government's had on it up until this point?
I've been speaking up on this, particularly post-Christchurch, needing or calling on, in particular, that our agencies take this seriously. Other agencies like the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security in the last 12 months have drastically revised their threat assessments about right-wing extremism. Right-wing extremism is not a political term. American scholars who track this have grouped a range of different categories or groups in this, and have been saying that it needs to be taken much more seriously. And I do welcome the fact that ASIO has now said that they've been tracking it. I have to say I've been staggered by some of the things that they've seen, not just the saluting of swastikas and Nazi emblems, but the fact that there's been weapons collection and training undertaken too. And I think that it really now demonstrates how serious this has been rising right under our very noses, and we do need to be able to deal with this.
So why is it so significant, the terminology around right-wing extremism, left-wing extremism? The Home Affairs Minister was on this morning saying that it doesn't matter where the ideology comes from, it's just the threat that needs to be acknowledged. Just
know this, nowhere beyond the mouth of the Home Affairs Minister have people been talking about so-called left-wing extremism. I mentioned a few moments ago, American scholars have labelled a whole range of groups from neo-Nazis to extreme anti-abortionists in this grouping. The fact that the Home Affairs Minister sought to inject that level of politicisation into this demonstrates more a reflection of his thinking. I would be calling on the government to refer to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security an urgent review into what is happening in respect of right-wing extremism in Australia. I've said previously I don't care if it's Islamist or supremacist. If they present a threat to national security, it should be taken seriously. And if the government doesn't do it, then the Senate should take up the opportunity as afforded by Senator McAllister's upcoming bill that should give powers to the PJCIS to initiate its own reviews into these things. But they should definitely, as a result of ASIO's reassessment, be initiating that PJCIS inquiry as a matter of haste.
The Home Affairs Minister says that that ASIO, other security agencies, have been looking intensely at right-wing extremism for the last 10 years. Why would a review by the PJCIS add more to that discussion?
Because, for example, they have undertaken the prescribing of certain groups, even if they're offshore and not operating in Australia. They've undertaken those reviews to determine the threats. These groups, post Christchurch, have been using online forums, like 4chan and 8chan. They have been trying to motivate others to undertake replica attacks. We've seen some terrible things happen on American soil, particularly in El Paso and other Jewish synagogues as well, where they've undertaken violent acts. They should also undertake an inquiry to determine whether or not the measures on countering violent extremism, how successful or otherwise they've been, and whether or not new measures should be undertaken and new funding undertaken in that regard. The UK has prescribed 2 of these groups in the course of the last 12 months, one just in a matter of hours. We haven't done any of that here, and we've identified groups as a result of Mr Burgess, or the Director General Burgess's statements last night. They've identified groups here. Now, we should be looking at doing exactly the same as what is done elsewhere in terms of prescribing these groups and tackling it.
Does prescribing these groups, so what he described in his speech was suburban living rooms, people setting up Nazi flags, salutes, that kind of thing. Does giving them a designation give them more credence than they're due, make them seem more official, seem more organised, when it could just be small fringe dwellers engaging in really abhorrent behaviour, but not of the same level as a terrorist organisation?
Well, what he also indicated too overnight in his words is that this is a lot more advanced in terms of the collection of weapons and the undertaking of training. We wouldn't tolerate that in any other circumstance, so why should we tolerate it in this one? We should take the steps to deal with this now, rather than have either an organised group or a lone wolf undertake the type of things that we've seen happen in the last 12 months either in places as close to us as New Zealand or in the US, and where it's evident that these groups are talking amongst themselves and encouraging similar acts. I would think that on the basis of that, Annalise, that's enough for us to say, treat this seriously and let's deal with it in advance rather than undertake reviews post-event. Let's avoid that event altogether and keep Australians safe.
And one of the other issues of the day has been this motion that's been moved by Senator Christina Keneally and Senator Penny Wong, calling for Bettina Arndt to be stripped of her Order of Australia. That will be heard this afternoon in the Senate. Do you support that Bettina Arndt be stripped of her Order of Australia?
I think when you also have people from across the political aisle within the Liberal Party calling for this and calling for the reflection of these remarks and repudiating the remarks, I think there is, in effect, across political parties, a concern about what has been said and whether or not it's diminished, in part, the value of the warding of those very important recognitions. So, yeah, I absolutely do support it.
And Nick McKim was also calling for the family law inquiry to be reviewed, Pauline Hanson's role in it in particular. Would you support that as well?
What I might do is I might refer that to people that are very much across the detail. I'm not going to pretend to answer a question that I've not necessarily been across that, but given that family law by its very nature needs us to be sensitive and careful about the recommendations that are made given the potential impacts on families, I think it should be done in a sober and careful way whenever we're making reforms in this space, and we shouldn't be doing knee-jerk movements based on some people's sudden views as opposed to what people have had to deal with day in, day out in managing the breakup of couples and what that does to their families.
Ed Husic, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Annalise.